August 19, 1942, 5 a.m. The first landing craft hit the beach at Dieppe, and the machine guns opened up before the ramps even dropped. Not warning shots, not suppressing fire. Execution fire. German MG-42s running at 1,200 rounds per minute tore through the steel ramps and the men behind them before a single Canadian boot touched French sand. Bodies folded into the water. Men who had trained for months, who had written letters home the night before, who had photographs in their breast pockets, were dead before the smoke cleared from the first burst. By noon, 3,367 Canadian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. By nightfall, fewer than 1,400 made it back to England unwounded. One day, one beach, one catastrophic avoidable disaster. And the men who sent them there safe in London, untouched, already drafting explanations. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. We're building a community of people who believe history is not just what happened, it's why it still matters. Now, 2 years after Dieppe. August 1944, Normandy, France. The most powerful British general of the entire war sat down to write orders that would end a man's career. The man he was about to fire. A thin-faced, careful Canadian general that almost nobody considered dangerous. A bureaucrat, a paper pusher, a man who had spent the years between the wars arguing over military budgets in Ottawa, while other men were building legends. What happened next will shock you. Because that quiet, overlooked Canadian general looked Bernard Montgomery straight in the eye and said something so calm, so precise, and so absolutely devastating that Montgomery, the man who had stared down Rommel in the desert, the man who had never backed down from anyone, looked away first. He said, "Try firing me. Try, and you will face Canada, not the Canadian Army, not a strongly worded diplomatic note. Canada. The whole nation, its government, its people, its parliament, and every political consequence that comes with 4 letters written across the top of an Allied command structure already held together with wire and stubbornness." This is the story of General Harry Crerar, a man nobody feared, a man nobody watched, a man who understood something that Montgomery, for all his brilliance, had completely missed. And because of what Crerar understood, because of that one confrontation on one August day, thousands of Canadian soldiers lived through the worst battle of the entire Northwest European campaign. This is the story of how an overlooked bureaucrat saved an army. By the summer of 1944, the Allied campaign in northwestern Europe was simultaneously winning and breaking apart from the inside. 2 million soldiers were on the European continent. The D-Day landings of June 6th had worked. The Atlantic Wall had cracked. German forces were being pushed backward across Normandy, in what the newspapers back home were calling an unstoppable wave. Towns were being liberated. Civilians were putting flowers on Allied vehicles. The headlines made ordinary people believe the war might be over by Christmas. Inside the headquarters tents scattered across the Normandy countryside, the picture looked entirely different. The canvas walls were covered in maps marked with lines that kept moving, yes, but the space between those lines was soaked in blood and argument, and the particular exhaustion of men who had been fighting not just the Germans, but each other. Coalition warfare is not what the history books make it look like. It is not clean collaboration between noble allies marching in the same direction. It is constant negotiation between nations who believe their soldiers deserve respect, their commanders deserve autonomy, and their sacrifices deserve recognition. The British had been fighting since 1939. The Canadians had been fighting since 1939. The Americans had arrived with more equipment and more money and more of everything except years of hard experience watching their men die for the cause. And sitting above all of them, beret-tilted eyes, sharp ego running at full capacity, every hour of every day, was General Bernard Montgomery. As commander of the 21st Army Group, Montgomery controlled every Allied ground force in northwestern Europe. He was used to obedience. He expected it the way most people expect gravity. He had removed subordinates before, without a second thought, without a single visible moment of hesitation. Generals who crossed him were reassigned, their careers effectively finished before they were old enough to have truly started. The conventional wisdom inside every headquarters tent in Normandy that summer was simple and understood by everyone who wanted to keep their job. You did not cross Montgomery. You did not argue with him. You did not prioritize anything above his meetings. You did not make him wait. Nobody appeared less likely to challenge this than Harry Crerar. At 56 years old, Crerar was precise in the way that careful men become precise after decades of working in environments that punish mistakes. His speech was measured. His writing was methodical. His uniform was correct, and his desk was organized. He did not ride horses toward enemy lines. He did not deliver speeches that made young men want to die for him. He had spent the years between the wars in Ottawa offices arguing over defense budgets in a country that had decided in the 1930s that it did not want a war and was not willing to spend money preparing for one. The military experts around Montgomery looked at Crerar and saw exactly what they expected to see. A staff officer who had risen beyond his natural level. A careful administrator in a world that rewarded boldness. What they missed, what Montgomery had fundamentally dangerously missed, was the thing Crerar understood more clearly than anyone in that campaign. He was not simply a general. He was Canada's general. And those two words carried a weight that had nothing to do with tactics or battlefield charisma. They carried the weight of a democratic government that had sent over 500,000 of its citizens into uniform. They carried the weight of every Canadian family that had watched the Dieppe casualty lists come through in August 1942 and asked why their sons had been sent to die on a beach that the planners had known was wrong from the beginning. They carried the weight of a country that had been fighting this war since the very start, that had watched tens of thousands of its men die in the First World War under British generals who treated Canadian soldiers as useful bodies rather than men from a sovereign allied nation, and that had spent the decades since making absolutely certain that would never happen again. That was Crerar's foundation. Not arrogance, not ambition. Constitutional reality fought for and established through years of political work long before either man had set foot in Normandy. The 1st Canadian Army had officially taken command of its sector in Normandy on July 23, 1944. Less than 4 weeks before the confrontation. 4 weeks to prove yourself in the most complicated military campaign in the history of the Western world. The force Crerar commanded was not simply Canadian. It contained British formations, a Polish armored division, Belgian units, Czech soldiers, and others from nations across occupied Europe, all of whom had to be supplied, coordinated, and directed across a front line stretching for miles through the broken Normandy countryside. The logistics required to keep that many different national units moving in the right direction was the kind of challenge that would have tested any commander regardless of experience. Crerar was managing it carefully, methodically, with enormous attention to process. Montgomery did not value methodical. He valued fast, bold, and completely obedient. Then came August 19, 1944. Montgomery scheduled a commander conference. He expected Crerar to attend. It was standard. It was expected. Under normal military hierarchy, it was non-negotiable. Crerar sent his chief of staff in his place, and went to a memorial service instead. Not because he had forgotten the meeting, not because he was confused about the priority. He went because August 19th was the 2nd anniversary of Dieppe, the day 3,367 Canadian soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured on a French beach in a raid that went wrong from the first minutes. For the men who survived it, for the families who had received the telegram, for the country that had watched the casualty list arrive and tried to understand what had happened and why Dieppe was not a historical event filed away in archives. It was an open wound. It was the reason Crerar believed with everything he had that Canadian soldiers deserved a commander who remembered them, who counted them, who showed up. When Montgomery understood what Crerar had done, the temperature in every room he occupied dropped. In Montgomery's world, there was one word for what Crerar had done: insubordination. A ceremony. A ceremony had been placed above a meeting called by the commander of the entire army group. The response in any normal military situation was clear. You removed the offending officer. You made an example. You moved on. Montgomery began drafting the orders. What he had not calculated, what his enormous intelligence for all its operational brilliance had failed to factor, was the framework that made Crerar immovable. The man who had built that framework was not in the room. General Andrew MacNaughton, Crerar's predecessor as commander of the 1st Canadian Army, had spent years before Normandy fighting to establish Canadian command independence. He had argued it in London. He had argued it in Ottawa. He had made enemies doing it. He had ultimately been pushed out himself, partly through British pressure. His removal had been its own kind of lesson, and Crerar had absorbed every word of it. MacNaughton had built the walls. Crerar was standing inside them, and he was not moving. His response came without drama, without a single raised voice. He told Montgomery he understood the authority of the Allied command structure. And then he explained the part Montgomery had missed. Crerar did not serve solely under British command. He served under the authority of the Canadian government, which retained ultimate say over the deployment and treatment of Canadian forces. Removing Crerar was not a personnel decision. It was a political event. Loud, public, impossible to contain. It would land directly on the desks of Eisenhower, Churchill, and Prime Minister Mackenzie King in Ottawa simultaneously. Every wire service in the Allied world would have the story within hours. Allied unity, already requiring constant careful management, would fracture at the exact moment when the campaign needed it most. Try firing me, and you will face Canada. Montgomery understood the message immediately. He was not politically foolish, whatever his other qualities. A public confrontation over the removal of a sovereign nation's army commander, in the middle of the most important military campaign in a generation with a government certain to respond through every available channel, was a problem with no clean solution and enormous potential to damage the war effort he was supposed to be winning. He backed down. Crerar stayed. The world did not stop to notice. There was no announcement, no acknowledgement in the official record that a quiet Canadian general had just held his ground against the most powerful military ego in the Western world and won. The maps in the headquarters tents were updated. The artillery kept rumbling. The 1st Canadian Army went back to the brutal, unglamorous work of fighting northwest through Europe. But the impact of that August confrontation would be measured not in headlines. It would be measured in blood and frozen water, and the number of men who still had a commander fighting for them when the worst was still to come. Because what was coming next made Normandy look almost manageable. There was a port called Antwerp, and a river estuary called the Scheldt, and a battle that historians would later call one of the most demanding sustained operations fought by any Allied force in the entire campaign. And it was coming fast. In Part 2, we go into the water, and we don't come back dry. Crerar had won the argument. Montgomery had backed down. The 1st Canadian Army still had its commander, and for one brief moment in August 1944, it looked like the worst was over. It was not over. It had barely started. Here is the number that should stop you cold. September 4th, 1944. The day Allied forces captured the port of Antwerp, one of the largest and most strategically vital ports in all of Europe. The docks were intact. The cranes were standing. The warehouses were ready. It was a perfect prize handed to the Allies without the destruction that had crippled other ports. And for the next 85 days, not a single Allied supply ship sailed into it. 85 days. While men died for lack of fuel. While armored divisions sat idle across France and Belgium because there was nothing to put in their tanks. While the supply crisis that was quietly strangling the entire Allied war machine grew worse with every passing week. The port was there. The ships were ready. And the Scheldt estuary, the 50-mile stretch of water connecting Antwerp to the North Sea, remained in German hands. This is where the story gets darker. Montgomery had a choice in early September 1944. He could clear the Scheldt and open Antwerp immediately. Or he could launch Operation Market Garden, the ambitious airborne assault on the Rhine crossing at Arnhem. He chose Market Garden. He chose the bridge. He chose the bold stroke, the headline operation, the kind of campaign that would look magnificent on maps and in memoirs. Eisenhower had told him clearly. Bedell Smith had told him clearly. His own logistics officers had told him clearly. Clear the Scheldt first. Open Antwerp. Fix the supply chain before it collapses. Montgomery overruled them all. Market Garden launched September 17th and ended in failure at Arnhem 9 days later, costing thousands of lives and solving nothing. And while it failed, while the paratroopers at the bridge held on and then didn't, the Germans were not idle. Every week, Montgomery delayed the Scheldt operation was a week German engineers spent strengthening defenses along the estuary banks. They opened the dikes deliberately, intentionally flooding the low polders of the Dutch and Belgian countryside, turning flat farmland into a cold gray inland sea that stretched in every direction. They zeroed their artillery on every road and raised path that remained above the water. They turned 50 miles of river estuary into something that had no good name in the existing military vocabulary. When Crerar's staff brought him the intelligence reports on the German preparations in late September, the picture was already bad. By early October, it was catastrophic. Crerar understood with complete clarity what his army was being asked to do. He also understood something else. He was still being asked to do it without the resources it required. Montgomery's headquarters had allocated insufficient forces for the Scheldt operation from the beginning. The priority was elsewhere. The priority was always elsewhere. Crerar requested additional formations. He was refused. He requested more bridging equipment for the assault across the flooded polders. He was refused. He submitted a detailed operational estimate showing that the German defenses had doubled in strength since September and that the casualty projections had risen accordingly. The estimate was noted and filed. "You have your orders." Montgomery's chief of staff told Crerar's representative at a coordination meeting in late September. "The 1st Canadian Army will clear the Scheldt with the forces allocated." Crerar's representative looked at the man across the table. "The forces allocated are not sufficient for the task as it now exists. The situation has changed materially since the allocation was made. The allocation stands." That was the conversation. That was the entire conversation. 2 sentences of refusal and a closed door. Crerar had won the political argument in August. He had proven that his position was constitutionally protected and politically immovable. But winning the argument about command authority was entirely different from getting the resources his men needed to survive what was coming. And what was coming was unlike anything the 1st Canadian Army had yet faced. The unexpected ally arrived not from above, but from beside. General Guy Simons, commanding the 2nd Canadian Corps under Crerar, was in many ways everything Crerar was not. Aggressive, creative, operationally bold in the way that Montgomery's headquarters understood and respected. Where Crerar was methodical, Simons was inventive. He had already demonstrated at Operation Totalize in August that he could think outside the conventional. He had taken unarmored artillery carriers, removed their guns, and created improvised armored personnel carriers to get infantry across open ground without losses that would have been catastrophic in standard trucks. Crerar had approved it. Let him run with it. And it had worked. Now Simons came to Crerar with an operational plan for the Scheldt that was by any reasonable standard insane. The flooding that the Germans had used as a weapon could be turned against them. The amphibious equipment that standard military doctrine considered secondary, the Buffalo's tracked amphibious vehicles originally designed for river crossings, could become the primary assault vehicles for an attack across what was essentially an open sea of freezing water. Instead of fighting the flooding, Simons proposed fighting through it, using it, making it the terrain of advance rather than the obstacle to advance. Every conventional military instinct said no. You do not assault prepared defensive positions across open water with no cover in vehicles that move at walking pace. You do not ask infantry to advance through chest-deep cold water toward machine gun positions on raised dikes that can see them coming from 500 meters. You do not strip away every element of tactical surprise that land operations can provide and replace it with a slow, cold, visible approach across water that the defenders have had weeks to prepare for. The plan had 100 ways to fail, and the men who would execute it had exactly 0 ways to hide. Crerar approved it. Not because it was safe, because it was the only thing that had a chance of working with the forces he actually had. The operation began October 2, 1944. The first assaults targeted the South Bevelin Peninsula and the island of Walcheren, the key terrain controlling the northern and southern banks of the Scheldt estuary. The soldiers who crossed the start line that morning knew exactly what they were walking into. The water was cold. In the North Sea autumn, the temperature of the flooded polders rarely climbed above 10 degrees Celsius. Cold enough to kill a man who stayed in too long. Cold enough to make your hands stop working when you needed them most. The buffaloes moved out across the gray water in the early morning dark engines, loud in air that smelled of salt and diesel, and the particular cold dampness of a European autumn that gets into your bones and does not leave. The men inside them held their rifles above the waterline and said nothing. There was nothing to say. German 88s opened up from the dike positions on the far shore. The water around the vehicles erupted in columns of spray. The lead buffalo took a direct hit, and the men inside it went into the water. The ones who could swim, swam. The ones who could not, didn't. The second wave kept moving. The third wave kept moving. They kept moving because stopping in the water was dying, and moving toward the shore was at least dying with a purpose. When the ramps dropped on the dike approaches, the infantry came out firing into positions they could barely see in the pre-dawn dark, and they cleared those positions by the method that has not changed since the First War was fought. They went forward until the men in front of them were dead or running. It was not elegant. It was not the kind of operation that would look impressive on a briefing map. It was the grinding, terrible, unglamorous work of taking ground that someone else has decided to hold at all costs. By the end of the first week, the casualty figures were already climbing past what the operational estimates had projected. By the end of the second week, the 1st Canadian Army had taken more losses in 14 days than in the entire Normandy campaign. The 13,000 casualty figure that historians would later attach to the Scheldt campaign was not abstract. It was 13,000 individual men who came out of that water on stretchers or did not come out at all. It was the cost of 85 days of delay. It was the price of Market Garden. It was what the flooded polders charged for every week the Germans had been allowed to prepare undisturbed. But the dikes fell. One by one, position by position, the German defenses along the Scheldt were taken and cleared. The Polish 1st Armored Division fought on the southern approaches. British formations held the flanks. Czech and Belgian units contributed where the line required them. The multinational force that Crerar had commanded with consistency and respect through months of institutional friction held together under conditions that would have broken a force led by someone the soldiers did not trust. November 8, 1944. The last German resistance on the Scheldt estuary was cleared. November 28th, the first Allied convoy sailed into Antwerp, 85 days after the port had been captured intact and waiting. The supply crisis began to ease. The fuel began to flow. The armored divisions that had been sitting idle started moving again, and Montgomery, reviewing the campaign from his headquarters, wrote in his private correspondence that Crerar had lacked grip, that the 1st Canadian Army had required more direction than it should have, that the commander had not been a man of outstanding ability. He wrote these words about the man whose army had just fought through water to solve the strategic problem that his own choices had created and then made catastrophically worse. But there was something else in those intelligence reports coming in from the east. Something that would make the Scheldt, for all its horror, look like a rehearsal. The Germans were massing in the Ardennes in the winter. And what was coming in December 1944 would test not just Crérar's army, but every assumption the Allied command had made about what winning actually meant. In Part 3, the snow starts falling. And the war starts again from the beginning. The Scheldt was finished. The port of Antwerp was open. The supply lines were flowing again. For exactly 3 weeks, it looked like the Allied command had turned the corner, and the road to Germany was finally clear. Then, December 16, 1944 arrived. In the pre-dawn darkness of that morning, 250,000 German soldiers and 1,000 tanks punched through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. In 72 hours, the Germans advanced 50 miles. In 1 week, they surrounded 22,000 American soldiers at Bastogne. The Allied command that had been planning victory celebrations was suddenly fighting for survival, and every unit, every formation, every army in northwestern Europe was pulled into the emergency response. The war that everyone had assumed was nearly over had just informed everyone that it had opinions of its own. And now, this was no longer a story about one general and one argument. This was a story about whether the Allied coalition could hold together long enough to win at all. German intelligence had been tracking the 1st Canadian Army's performance through the Scheldt campaign with growing alarm. The reports coming into Wehrmacht headquarters in late November described a force that had executed an amphibious assault across flooded terrain with a level of coordination and tenacity that contradicted everything German planners had assumed about Commonwealth forces following the Normandy stalemate. The casualty exchange ratios from the Scheldt disturbed them. The 1st Canadian Army had taken 13,000 casualties, yes, but the German 15th Army defending the estuary had been effectively destroyed. Entire divisions ceased to exist as fighting formations. Commanders who had reported confident defensive positions in September were filing reports about combat effectiveness, dropping below 30% by early November. The Germans had expected the flooding to stop the attack. It had not stopped it. It had slowed it, and the force on the other side of the water had kept coming anyway. German commanders along the Dutch and Belgian front began requesting emergency reinforcements in late November. The requests were denied. The Ardennes offensive was consuming everything. But the intelligence assessments that accompanied those requests contained a phrase that would appear repeatedly in German operational documents through December and January. The Canadian formation demonstrates an unusual tolerance for attrition. That was the German military's way of saying something simpler. These men did not stop. And their commander did not ask them to stop when stopping would have been easier. What those intelligence reports could not capture was the internal pressure building inside the 1st Canadian Army's headquarters through December. The Bulge had reorganized every Allied priority. Montgomery had been given command of all Allied ground forces north of the Bulge breakthrough, including American formations. A decision that created new frictions with American commanders that made the Crerar confrontation in August look like a mild disagreement. Resources that Crerar had been promised for the next phase of operations were redirected south. Planning timelines collapsed. Staff officers who had been working on Operation Veritable, the planned assault through the Reichswald forest into the German Rhineland, were suddenly working on contingency plans for a German breakthrough that had not yet been stopped. There were voices inside the Canadian command structure officers who had watched the Scheldt casualties accumulate day by day, who began asking whether the operational tempo being demanded was sustainable. 13,000 men in 6 weeks. Against a single estuary. What would the Rhineland cost? The Reichswald was 40 square miles of dense forest sitting on the German border, turned into a fortified defensive zone by engineers who had been preparing it since September. Beyond the forest lay the Siegfried Line. Beyond that, the Rhine. The Germans defending it were not the exhausted remnants of a retreating army. They were men fighting on their own soil for the first time with every reason to hold and no reason to retreat. Crerar read the casualty projections for Veritable and did not share them widely. Some numbers you keep to yourself until after the battle. The bulge collapsed under Allied pressure by late January 1945. The Germans had shot their last reserve. The counteroffensive that was supposed to reach Antwerp had been stopped 50 miles short. And now, the road to Germany was genuinely open, not in the newspaper sense, but in the operational sense. Every German formation west of the Rhine was now vulnerable, and the 1st Canadian Army had a mission. February 8, 1945. 0500 hours. The Reichswald, Germany. The artillery opened up first. 1,400 guns firing simultaneously along a 9-mile front. The sound was not like thunder. It was beyond thunder. It was the sound of the air itself being reorganized by concussive force. A continuous wall of noise that lasted not for seconds, but for hours, reshaping the frozen German positions in the forest into something that no longer resembled defensive lines. Soldiers who were there and survived described it decades later with the same phrase independent of each other across dozens of interviews. They said the ground moved. The infantry went forward at first light. 5 divisions abreast. Canadian, British, and Scottish formations moving into the trees in the February cold frost. On the ground breath, visible in the air, the forest ahead of them dark and broken by shell fire, and defended by men who had been told to hold at any cost. The mud that had been frozen solid overnight was already softening under thousands of boots. By mid-morning, it was ankle-deep. By afternoon, it was knee-deep. The Reichswald, in February 1945, was not fighting weather. It was survival weather. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division hit the village of Weiler first. German paratroopers defending the approaches had survived the artillery in deep bunkers and came out firing the moment the barrage lifted. The lead Canadian companies took the fire and kept moving. Weiler changed hands 3 times in 6 hours. 3 times. Forward. Back. Forward. The village was rubble by the time the Canadians held it, permanently rubble that smelled of cordite and frost, and the particular sharpness of broken masonry in cold air. The 2nd Canadian Division pushed through the forest itself, where the trees gave the German defenders cover that the artillery had only partially destroyed. Visibility was 20 meters. Sometimes 10. Soldiers navigated by compass and by the sound of firing ahead of them. Contact with flanking units was lost and re-established, and lost again. The Germans had sighted their machine gun positions to cover every natural approach, every gap between the trees that a man might choose to run through. The Canadians found those positions by running toward the firing and flanking left or right, until someone found the gap in the coverage that killed the position from behind. It was not elegant. It was what the ground required. By February 10th, the first German defensive line through the Reichswald had been broken. By February 13th, the forest itself had been cleared of organized resistance. The German 84th Infantry Division, which had been defending the northern sector of the Reichswald, was reduced from 12,000 men to fewer than 3,000 capable of fighting. The 7th Parachute Division elite troops, who had been told the forest was impenetrable, had lost 40% of their strength in 5 days. German Army Group H Commander Johannes Blaskowitz filed a report on February 14th that reached Hitler's headquarters the same evening. It described the Canadian assault as relentless and noted that the rate of defensive collapse had exceeded all prepared contingency estimates. He requested permission to withdraw behind the Rhine immediately. The request was denied. Hitler ordered the Rhineland held to the last man. Blaskowitz held. His men did not hold for long. The breakthrough from the Reichswald opened into the Rhine floodplain by late February. Canadian and British formations moved through the towns and villages of the German Rhineland with a speed that contrasted sharply with the grinding forest fighting. 52 German towns were liberated or captured in 10 days. German civilians who had been told the war was still winnable watched Allied vehicles moving east without stopping and began making private calculations about which side of history they wanted to be on when it was over. German soldiers who had fought from fixed positions for months found themselves suddenly without positions to defend, falling back toward a river, that their own high command would not let them cross. By March 1st, the 1st Canadian Army had advanced 30 miles beyond the Reichswald. By March 10th, they stood on the banks of the Rhine. The total German losses in the Rhineland campaign, what the histories would call the Battle of the Rhineland, exceeded 90,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. The Allied forces under Crerar's command sustained approximately 23,000 casualties across the entire operation, British and Canadian combined. Severe. Costly. But the exchange ratio told a story that German Army Group H could not survive. For every Allied soldier lost, 4 German soldiers were taken out of the war. An army defending its own country on prepared ground in winter had been broken in 5 weeks. The news spread through Allied headquarters with a quality that was different from earlier victories. The Scheldt had been a necessary operation, unglamorous, fought in water, noticed primarily by logistics officers and supply chain planners who suddenly had a functioning port. The Rhineland was unmistakable. It was Germany. It was the border crossed and the last major defensive line west of the Rhine shattered. War correspondents who had been covering the campaign since Normandy filed dispatches that used words they had been saving. Words like decisive, words like irreversible. Montgomery characteristically framed the campaign in his own terms. The 21st Army Group had achieved a strategic breakthrough. The coordination between formations had been excellent. The planning had been sound. He did not mention Crerar by name in his public statements. In private, he noted that the Canadian performance had been adequate. That word, adequate, applied to 23,000 casualties and 90,000 Germans removed from the order of battle. Adequate. General Maczek of the Polish 1st Armored Division, which had fought under Crerar's command from Normandy through the Rhineland, wrote to his corps commander in March 1945 with a different assessment. He described the campaign as the finest sustained combined arms operation he had witnessed in 6 years of war. He said that Crerar had commanded a multinational force through conditions that would have caused command breakdown in any organization built on mistrust, and it had held. He did not use the word adequate. By March 1945, the war in Europe had perhaps 8 weeks left. The Rhine crossing was coming. The drive to Berlin was coming. The actual end was visible from where men stood on the riverbank and looked east. But the man who had stood in a headquarters tent in August 1944 and told the most powerful general in the Western world that firing him would mean meeting Canada, that man was already thinking about something beyond the battle, about what came after, about what the price of all of it actually meant, and who was going to be asked to pay attention to the accounting. That story, the story of what happened to Crerar when the guns finally stopped, and what the war had cost, and what was done with the men who had paid the cost, and what a country learns or fails to learn from sending 500,000 of its people into a war. That story is the one that history almost forgot entirely. In Part 4, the war ends, and the reckoning begins. From a bureaucrat nobody feared to the commander who broke the Siegfried Line's western anchor. From a quiet confrontation in a Normandy headquarters tent to the banks of the Rhine. From Dieppe's open wound to the liberation of 52 German towns in 10 days. Harry Crerar had commanded the 1st Canadian Army through the longest, costliest, and most consequential campaign in Canadian military history, and he had done it without a single headline with his name on it. But the cliffhanger from Part 3 asked the real question. Not what happened to the campaign. What happened to the man? What does a country do with the general who held the line when the most powerful commander in the Western world tried to remove him? What does history do with a man who won by being methodical in a world that only noticed the bold? The answer, as it turns out, is complicated. And it says something about us that the complication is the most important part of the story. May 8, 1945, VE Day. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. In cities across Canada, Britain and the liberated countries of Europe, people poured into the streets and wept and embraced strangers and made noise that had been held inside for 6 years. Harry Crerar was in the Netherlands when the news arrived. He did not pour into any street. He went to his desk and began writing the orders required to begin the process of demobilizing the 1st Canadian Army. 500,000 soldiers needed to get home. Someone had to organize the trains and the ships and the processing centers and the paperwork. Someone had to do the methodical work that nobody would remember or celebrate. Crerar did it. He returned to Canada in the autumn of 1945, without a parade specifically for him, without a moment that the newspapers treated as historic, without the kind of public reception that the size of his command and the scale of his achievement might have warranted. He was promoted to general, the highest rank in the Canadian Army, one of only 2 Canadians ever to hold it. He received the Order of the Bath. He received honors from the Netherlands, from Belgium, from France. He sat for the formal photographs and wrote the formal letters and handled the formal obligations with the same precision he had brought to every other formal obligation of his career. And then, in 1946, he retired. He was 58 years old. He went home to Ottawa, to a house on a quiet street, to a life that looked from the outside almost identical to the life he had lived before the war. He took up golf. He wrote papers about military organization that were read carefully by defense planners and almost nobody else. He attended the reunions of the veterans he had commanded and shook hands with men who had been in the Scheldt water and in the Reichswald mud, and who recognized him and who stood a little differently when they saw him. Not at attention, something more personal than that. The way men stand when they are near someone who they believe kept them alive. Montgomery published his memoirs in 1958. He described the Scheldt campaign in terms that credited his own strategic vision. He described Crerar with the word he had always used: adequate. The book sold widely. It shaped how the campaign was understood by the generation that read it. Crerar read it and did not publish a public response. He wrote letters to historians who he believed were getting the record wrong, precise and detailed letters with citations and dates and specific corrections. He kept doing the methodical work. Nobody outside of academic military history paid significant attention. Harry Crerar died on April 1, 1965. He was 77 years old. The obituaries were respectful and accurate and short. The man who had commanded more soldiers than any Canadian in history, who had held his constitutional ground against the most powerful general in the Western world, who had led a multinational army through the worst terrain of the entire Northwest European campaign, received the kind of obituary that careful, methodical men receive. Adequate. But the décon, the real legacy, the kind that does not appear in obituaries, was already built and running and growing in directions that Crerar had made possible, and that nobody had properly credited to him. The principle that Crerar had defended in that August 1944 confrontation was not simply about his own command. It was about the structural relationship between a democratic nation and the military forces it deploys. The argument he had made to Montgomery that a sovereign government retains ultimate authority over its military forces, even within a coalition command structure, became the foundational principle of post-war NATO's command arrangements. Every NATO status of forces agreement, every arrangement that allows Canadian, Dutch, German, or Norwegian soldiers to serve under American or British command, while retaining the right of their home governments to withdraw consent, traces its practical working logic back to the framework that men like MacNaughton built and Crerar defended. This is not a small thing. NATO has existed for 75 years. It has managed the largest peacetime military coalition in history without the command authority disputes that tore apart previous coalitions. The reason that works, the reason a Canadian general serving under an American censeur does not face what Crerar faced in 1944 is precisely because the constitutional reality that Crerar refused to surrender became written into the alliance's founding documents. Historians of international law who have traced the lineage of these provisions estimate that the framework governs the deployment of forces from 32 nations, involving millions of soldiers in operations across dozens of countries. The bureaucrat from Ottawa, who spent the 1930s arguing about defense budgets that nobody wanted to fund, had built something that turned out to be load-bearing for the entire post-war international order. The tactical lessons of the Scheldt and the Rhineland traveled differently, but just as far. The amphibious assault techniques developed under Symons, with Crerar's approval for the Scheldt crossing, were studied extensively by military planners in the post-war years. The specific problem the 1st Canadian Army had solved, how to conduct a sustained assault across flooded terrain against prepared defensive positions with limited air support and insufficient armor, was not a problem that went away when the Second World War ended. It appeared again in the Korean Peninsula's river crossings. It appeared in Vietnam's Delta operations. It appears today in military planning for low-lying coastal regions, where climate change is making the kind of terrain Crerar's men fought through increasingly relevant to defense planners in a dozen countries. The Buffalo amphibious vehicle that Symons improvised into a primary assault platform in the Scheldt has direct descendants in every modern amphibious infantry carrier in NATO service. The lineage is direct and documented. The numbers, when you add them up across the full campaign, are staggering in the way that numbers from the Second World War always are. But that familiarity should not be allowed to dull. The 1st Canadian Army, under Crerar's command, from July 1944 to May 1945, cleared the Scheldt estuary, opened the port of Antwerp, fought through the Rhineland, and liberated the Western Netherlands. In doing so, it took approximately 45,000 casualties across all formations, Canadian, British, Polish, and others. In exchange, it removed from the German order of battle an estimated 180,000 soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. It liberated territory containing millions of civilians. It opened a port that ended the supply crisis, strangling the entire Allied war machine, and made the final drive into Germany logistically possible. The Dutch government, which had watched its western provinces occupied, flooded, and systematically starved through the hunger winter of 1944 to 1945, credited the liberation of the Netherlands as the act that saved approximately 20,000 Dutch civilians from starvation in the final months of the war. 20,000 people who lived because a methodical Canadian general refused to be fired in August 1944. The lesson about innovation here is not the one that business schools usually teach. The lesson is not that bold visionaries always triumph over cautious institutions. The lesson is more uncomfortable than that. Crerar was not bold in the conventional sense. He was not a visionary. He was a man who had done the slow, unglamorous work of understanding the actual rules of the system he operated in, so that when the system tried to use its power against him, he knew exactly where that power stopped. The innovation was not tactical, it was constitutional, and it required not genius, but patience, and not courage in the dramatic sense, but the specific courage of a man who has decided what he will not surrender, and has done the preparation to make that decision mean something. The institutions that resist innovation are usually not wrong that the innovation is risky. They are wrong that risk is the only relevant consideration. Montgomery was not wrong that Crerar was less tactically aggressive than he would have preferred. He was wrong that tactical aggression was the only thing a commander of the 1st Canadian Army needed to be. The multinational force required something else. It required consistency, fairness, respect for the national dignity of soldiers who were not fighting for the British Empire, but for their own countries, their own governments, their own reasons. Crerar provided that, and the army held together through water and mud and forest and winter because of it. Now, the final detail, the one that most histories leave out entirely. In the spring of 1945, as the war in Europe was ending and the 1st Canadian Army was moving through the Netherlands, they entered a region that had been under German occupation since 1940. 5 years. The Dutch civilians who came out to meet them were not in the condition of people who had been inconvenienced. They were in the condition of people who had been systematically starved. The German occupation authorities, in retaliation for a Dutch railway strike that had supported the market garden operation in September 1944, had cut food supplies to the Western Netherlands through the entire winter. By April 1945, the daily caloric ration for Dutch civilians in occupied territory had fallen below 500 calories. Children were dying. Adults were eating tulip bulbs. The hunger winter killed an estimated 18,000 to 22,000 Dutch people, most of them in the final months before liberation. When Canadian soldiers entered the Dutch towns in April and May 1945, they gave their rations to the civilians they found. Not some of their rations. Their rations. Soldiers who had been fighting for 10 months, who were themselves running on inadequate supply, handed food to strangers in a country that was not theirs. The Dutch families who received that food remembered it for the rest of their lives. Their children were told the story. Their grandchildren were told the story. Today, 80 years later, the Netherlands places tulips on Canadian war graves every spring. Not as a formal diplomatic gesture, but as a living practice maintained by Dutch families who remember what Canadian soldiers did when they did not have to do it. Crerar did not order his men to give away their rations. He did not need to. He had commanded those men long enough and treated them consistently enough that they understood without being told what kind of army they were part of and what that army was for. That is the thing that adequate does not capture, and that methodical does not capture, and that lacking grip absolutely does not capture. It is the thing that happened when a commander spent a year making every decision with the understanding that the men under him were citizens of a real country, with a real government and real families waiting for them, and that their lives and their conduct mattered in a way that extended beyond the operational objectives on the map. From a budget-arguing Ottawa administrator that nobody feared Harry Crerar built and commanded the largest army in Canadian history, defended the constitutional independence of his nation under direct pressure from the most powerful general in the Western world, and led a multinational force through the worst terrain of the Northwest European campaign without it breaking apart. Because of what he held in August 1944, 20,000 Dutch civilians lived through the winter. Because of what he built, 32 nations can serve in coalition today without surrendering their democratic accountability. Because of how he commanded Dutch families still put flowers on Canadian graves. The world does not always remember the methodical men. It remembers the bold ones, the theatrical ones, the ones who write their own memoirs first and loudest. But the world runs when it runs well on the work of people who understood the rules deeply enough to know which ones were load-bearing, who did the preparation that made the decisive moment possible, and who showed up to the memorial service when it mattered, even when someone powerful told them not to. That is the story. And that is why it was worth telling.